This morning we're starting with Peter Leonard, who is Director of Digital Humanities Lab at Yale University. He has his PhD in Scandinavian literature from University of Washington and was a Fulbright scholar during 2007 and 2008 at Uppsala University in Sweden. His research focuses around post-ethnic figurations of national belonging in European fiction, with emphasis on Scandinavian literature. Leonard also works with digital and quantitative methods in the humanities, including text mining, network analysis, image analysis, and corpus query engines. We welcome Peter to talk about Swedish identity and the literary imaginary.
Thanks very much, Cheryl, and thanks to everyone for coming out, and thanks especially to not only Cheryl, but all the rest of the organizers who've put this event together for all of us. So I guess I'm the first speaker this morning, and I want to thus focus on an aspect of diversity and multiculturalism in Scandinavia that is a little less clear-cut than public policy debates and is a little bit more difficult to quantify than changing demographics. But I hope that at least by the end of this talk, the notion of a literary imaginary could join other sociological and political science perspectives in helping us to understand the complicated conditions for multiculturalism and diversity in Scandinavia today. Now, there's some historical precedent for thinking that a literature, kind of a series of ideas debated in print, might be meaningful for periods of great transformative social change in Scandinavia. Because when Scandinavians have had to confront changing conditions in the past, they have historically treated literature as a kind of universally accessible and publicly oriented discursive space for debate and intellectual contention. The best example of this is, of course, during the modern breakthrough, a period between the 1870s and the 1890s that represented a great break from the romanticism that mostly characterized Scandinavian literature output before them. And this sort of traumatic break was spurred in no small part by Georg Brandes, speaking of famous Danish Jews, who admonished his fellow Scandinavian writers to catch up with the rest of the world, to look at the trends that were happening in other parts of Western Europe, and to, in following the lead of others from outside Scandinavia, to put problems under debate. So writers such as Henrik Ibsen and August Strindberg responded to Brandes' challenge. And what resulted was a very contentious and very productive period, which resulted in some of the most world-renowned literature that has ever emerged from Scandinavia, at least since the medieval period. These are the works that most of us are liable to read if we study Scandinavian in this country. So the subject of a lot of this work, as complex and non-monolithic as it was the rights and responsibilities of women in the new, rapidly urbanizing and rapidly industrializing societies in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. The rights of women to own property, to manage their own finances, to define their own identities. These are the subjects of works like Hedda Gabler or The Father. And of course, it's too soon to know if works from the first decade of this century, of the 21st century, will have anywhere as near as great of an impact as those from the end of the 19th century. But Scandinavian authors today are just as engaged as they were during the morality debates, during the Sedlighetsdebatt of the modern breakthrough in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And beginning in the early and mid-2000s, authors in the North began publishing a number of works that explored the boundaries and limits of national belonging. So I want to begin today by considering 4 young authors from Sweden who constitute, a kind of defensible starting point for exploring this question. I think they represent what we might term the post-ethnic turn in Swedish literature. So today we're going to be talking, at least initially, about Jonas Hassan Khemiri, Marjane Bakhtiari, Alejandro Leva-Wenger, and Johannes Anjuru. And of course, it's completely reductive to consider them in terms of their own personal biographies. But there are 3 characteristics of their lives and their work which I think are useful to us today. The first of this is that many of them were born in Sweden and those who weren't moved to Sweden as children. The second point is that because of this first fact, they have Swedish as either their first language or their primary language or one of their primary languages. And the third thing that is interesting about these authors is they depict a multi-ethnic society, a diverse society, a non-monolithic society, as a normal state of affairs, rather than a condition that is new or unusual or problematic. That's not to say that they don't remark upon it. In fact, a line from Johannes Anna first collection of poetry, De bara gudarna som är nya, is, I think, the first literary quote I've chosen this morning because it kind of captures what's new and interesting about this particular set of literary output. He writes, "You don't hear any Swedish words here. Even the Arabs have learned to yell mira, mira when they rush after a perfectly hit pass along the edge of the bike path." Now, as later examples will perhaps make more clear, there's a paradox at work in these literary texts we're going to be considering today, which take the multi-ethnic society as their theme. The poetry of the kind that is in De bara gudarna som är nya, in the part that I've quoted here, it derives its novelty, at least in part due to its evocation of spaces and social classes that stand at the margins of Swedish experience. And no matter what the individual author may intend, it can be difficult to escape market forces, which constantly look for the shock of the new to present in contexts as varied as physical bookstores, what books are put out when you walk into Akademibokhandeln, or who gets interviewed in newspapers when they have a new book out, and what kind of pictures are taken of them, which authors get pictures taken of them, or who's interviewed on television, who makes a good telegenic presence. So all of the works we're going to be looking at today, to a greater or lesser degree, present ethnicity as their frame, their theme, or their marketing device. So let's talk about how that happens. If I show you the cover of Jonas Kamiri's first novel, which is this book, the cover was designed by Lotta Kuhlhorn, Swedish designer. This is the kind of cover that makes Adolf Loos roll over in his grave, right? It's both ornament and crime. It's the completely opposite, the kind of high modernist funkis aesthetic, which characterizes Swedish politics and aesthetics in the 20th century. So at the same time that these literary works are being presented to readers as being about Sweden of the present moment, in the sense that they have the content that they can carry within them is about Sweden's current multicultural condition. At the same time that they're doing that, inside these works of poetry, of drama, of novels, they're presenting ethnic identity as unstable and the product of an individual's choices rather than the product of demographic change or political policy or anything like that. So it's certainly not about genetic makeup, it's not about where you're from, it's all about how you perform your identity. So how do these works do that? There are a lot of things we're going to talk about today, and all of these works are incredibly different. They work in different ways. So I've tried to sum them up with three themes. I think there are three unifying strategies that I can talk about. The first is that a lot of these works we're going to be looking at push the definition of Swedish literature. They're interested in expanding what is considered Swedish literature. In fact, in a couple cases, they're pushing the boundaries of what can be considered Swedish language. And they want that definition to be more expansive. They want it to be more heterogeneous. And secondly, much as the cover of Et Dagaröt is kind of the opposite of a functionalist aesthetic, a lot of the sort of thematic content of this work places the irrational, that is to say, imagination or fantasy, in explicit opposition to a society that since the 1930s has been guided by a progressive, even a utilitarian logic. And the third thing is, I think, one of the unifying strategies is the way that the fictional characters that are in these works perform identity is a key element in that identity's creation. We're going to see this along the axes of how characters talk in these books and also how they choose to present themselves to a broader public. Now, on this question of pushing the boundaries of the national, so you might ask yourself, why does literature need to push what's considered the Swedish language? Why does literature need to push against the boundaries of the national? One of the ways of thinking about this is to consider the Danish critic Hans Hauge, who published a work in 2003, Post Danmark, Politik og Æstetik hinsides det nationale. And so basically, he looks across the Sound, he looks at Sweden, and he says the following. He says, the nation state obliterated the difference between state and society, as did the post-war Labour Party state, the welfare state. Many Scandinavians, especially those who belong to Labour parties, don't distinguish at all between state and society, or between nation and state. And he goes on, Sweden in particular represents a country that still does not differentiate between state and society. Now, Hauge here is focusing on this sort of side effect of the highly successful experiments in social democracy in the 20th century in Scandinavia, this tight linkage between political state and the imagined community of the nation. But I think it's helpful here to think more broadly about other unexamined assumptions underlying Nordic societies. Because, as we heard yesterday, regardless of the actual state of affairs, if we think about the Roma peoples, the Jewish communities, the thousands of years of social contact between Germanic and Sami communities, it has been possible until quite recently to pretend that Scandinavia, in terms of these notions of white ethnicity, of Germanic language, of Nordic citizenship, it's possible to pretend that those were one and the same. If you drew circles like a Venn diagram, you'd end up with one circle. Regardless of reality, that's been a kind of common imagined case. In fact, if we think back to the last great moral panic of national belonging in Sweden, and here we think about the discussion about race biology that goes all the way into the 1930s, this is in a sense at least in part occasioned by the fact that there's a threat. There's a threat to the notion of being white, being Swedish, and having Swedish as your first language, and being a Swedish citizen. And this is, of course, the Finns. Always got to look out for the Finns. So what Herman Lundborg is interested in doing in Uppsala is he's interested in taking these kind of racial hygiene pictures of Finns because he really has this very practical goal. He needs to educate Swedes living in Sweden what Finns look like, because they pass. They look too white, and they speak Swedish. And the risk would be that you might accidentally marry a Finn, and then you're going to destroy your kind of genetic inheritance. So these pictures here, right, are, here's the Värmland Finn and the Finnish type from Värmland. So it really is kind of this notion of how can we police the borders of belonging when the sort of visual comprehension becomes threatened by Finnish immigration. Now, by the 1970s, as we heard yesterday, Olof Palme especially, as a kind of exponent of the notion of moral immigration, there are sort of ethical reasons to let in people from other parts of the world, in addition to the kind of guest worker notion which spreads from Germany. So Palme's notion of an open door to the global left, to let in people from places like Chile who were under threat by right-wing governments. These types of migration policies would ensure eventually that this tight linkage between appearance and ethnicity and state and citizen and language would be set on the long path towards dissolution. In fact, the current moment is kind of, in a sense, this echo of the 1970s demographically. So the imagined homogeneity of the nation would be replaced slowly but surely by this heterogeneity that some fear and others celebrate. So let's talk about celebration. It is, in fact, a kind of excitement about this difference, this performance of difference that begins Jonas Kamiri's first book, Et och Rött, One Eye Red or An Eye Red. So in English translation, Kamiri's book begins like this. Today was the last day of summer vacation, and therefore I helped Dad in the store. But what's lost in this translation is that this whole sentence is full of what we might call non-standard Swedish. There's a grammatical error in the third word. Normally in Swedish, we invert word order after an adverb of time or place. And this is one of only hundreds such deviations throughout the entire book. There's another one in the first sentence as well. After opening the first chapter with this syntactical deviance, this kind of mistake in Swedish, Kamiri changes the gender of a word in the last sentence of the first chapter. He basically says "sinliv" instead of "sitt liv." So there are a number of other stylistic differences in this book that garnered attention. Looking back on the reviews from 12 years ago, the thing that garnered the most attention was a lot of slang words, which had apparently, given the reviews, never been seen in literary fiction before, and a lot of these slang words were perceived to have come from Turkish or Francophone Arabic or other sort of sources. Looking back on it now, it's kind of like, slang is about 14 years out of date, but back in 2005, very exciting. There's a lot, this is described as suburban slang, which in American valence you have to translate into inner city slang, so that's a little confusing. But it's the syntactic differences that continue to stand out long after the slang loses its freshness. So I think the reason why we want to pay attention to syntax is the fact that in the fictional world of the book, in the literary world created by Kamiri, within the logic of the book, Halim, who is the protagonist of the book and also the author of the journal that this book represents, so this is a journal now. Halim, the main character, is born in Sweden. And more than being born in Sweden, so this means Swedish is his first language, he actually proves that he can write in grammatically perfect Swedish when he chooses to. How do we know this? Because when he transcribes his father's conversations with his father's friends from Arabic into Swedish, there are no grammatical errors. There's none of that kind of refusal to invert the word order after an adverb. So it's only when Halim is recording his own thoughts, his own world experiences and thoughts about the world in his journal, that he chooses to deviate from sort of standard Swedish. This choice is a self-conscious linguistic construction to express his identity. And this is what I want to turn to now to think about how Kamiri's novel pushes the boundaries of Swedish literature, Swedish language, in ways that sort of have to do with conscious rule breaking, and also in ways that I think were perhaps missed when the book first came out. There's a couple of infamous reviews of this book which say, this is just amazingly well done. All he needs is an editor, and it'll be even better, right? Just get that grammar checker working, and you'll be all set. And I think the contrast we want to draw here is with perhaps the lived experience as well as the literary output of one of the most famous first-generation immigrant authors in Sweden of the post-war period, that's Theodor Kallifatides, who says in this quote, "I experienced the beauty and richness of the Swedish language through Strindberg." So Kallifatides is, in sort of my reading of his biography, he's an economic migrant from Greece. I believe his first job was peeling potatoes in restaurant kitchens. So Kallifatides did not inherit Swedish as his first language. It's something that he had to come to in his 30s. Those of you in the room who've studied foreign language, it gets tough after you get out of college to do it now. So Swedish is not Kallifatides' birthright. Rather, he has to acquire it through the study of literary classics. So who is he going to take as this kind of mentor? Well, the originary fiction of Theodor Kallifatides, which he repeats in all sorts of autobiographical interviews and writings and interviews in newspapers, is the narrative of an immigrant's encounter with Swedish through Strindberg. This quote on the slide is about him refusing to give up any part of himself in the new language. He needs to sort of master the new language to fully express himself in the new country. And in other newspaper interviews, he's talked about how he was trying out lines from Miss Julian to pick up women in bars as he was learning Swedish. It did not go well, actually. But so what I want to turn to now is, I would think, essentially Kamiri's thoughts on the same question. And in contrast, the journal of Halim, which is the protagonist of Ettegarut, is kind of exponent of the author asking the questions shown on this slide. So let's look at this quote by the actual real-life author, Kamiri. Kamiri asks, "I begin to think about it as an act of power. What happens if you break down language deliberately? If you show the whole time that you know what it's called, but you change the word to be something else. I began to speculate about the power displacement that implicates or involves." So Kamiri is, of course, a native speaker of Swedish, and he doesn't sort of feel the same need to ape Strindberg to demonstrate that mastery, any more than I would have to, say, I read Shakespeare or something like that. At the micro level, though, Halim's journal, this fictional journal, pushes down at the borders of the Swedish language to make it more responsive to his own identity project, which is really what One I Read is about. Halim appropriates grammatical errors that he himself wouldn't make, but that he sees in his surrounding. It's in the service, he uses this non-standard syntax and some of the slang words in the service of sort of inventing an identity for himself. And in a time of language tests for citizenship, One I Read, I think, raises the question of whether mastery of Swedish by new kinds of citizens is the sine qua non of cultural expression. And it also explores what can be communicated via conscious rejection of the perfection of the national tongue. So here's a quote from the book, from Erdőgödöt. So this is part of basically Halim's identity project. Today I philosophize that there's also a third kind of blatte, and here we have to talk about like a general word for a non-white Swede, originally derogatory and sort of in the process of being appropriated. A blatte who stands completely free and is the kind that the sort of white Swedes hate the most, the revolutionary blatte, the thought sultan. So this is part of Halim's imagination of an Arabic identity that's inheriting for himself, who sees through all the lies and never lets himself get fooled, sort of like Al-Kindi, who cracked all the codes and wrote thousands of type books about astronomy and philosophy, but also about music and math. Last semester, he says, I was probably mostly a troublemaker. This is one of the types of blatte that he's been describing. From now on, I swear I'm going to be a thought sultan. So there are a lot of ways to talk about this consciousness, which is expressed in the language here. At its most banal, this is a kind of Holden Caulfield story, right? Somebody who sees all the phoniness of everybody except for himself. But alongside that teenage angst there's a kind of a glimmer of something genuinely new, a kind of post-ethnic Swedish imaginary, or a sense of belonging that somehow exceeds the bounds of Swedishness, can't be expressed in big svenska. And that sense of post-ethnic belonging struggles to emerge throughout Erdőgödöt, primarily because the writer of the journal Halim is, like all teenagers, possessed of extremely deficient understanding of the world around him. His shining view of the Arab world is completely unsullied by any kind of empirical experience. He's never been there. His father is very amused by his sort of teenage son's view of Arabic cultural inheritance. In a sense, if you think about what Gayatri Spivak has talked about in the sense of a strategic essentialism, Halim is here imagining a kind of monolithic blatte identity, a kind of monolithic non-white identity. And one that I think is really interesting to point out is not predicated purely on immigration, because Halim is born in Stockholm. So it's not purely about migration policy. It's about this question of assimilation or cultural integration. In his daydreams and journal entries, he binds together all of the non-white Swedes into this imagined community of native-born Swedes who somehow don't quite belong, who don't fit in. And just as Spivak found that in her work on lower caste Indians, that when you try to sort of create this subject, what you sort of strategic essentialism, think that everybody is a low caste as a sort of subject, what you inadvertently expose is the workings of the subject effect. Right? What you eventually expose is how we pretend that things sort of cohere in ways they don't always. So it's a kind of a confusion of cause for effect, a metalepsis, and that is completely present throughout this entire novel, in not least of which in the kind of invented immigrants in syntactic Creole, which characterizes the writing. That's the stuff we began with in terms of using the wrong syntax. But I think here's the way to think about Erdőgödöt. I think I can highly recommend looking at the second novel that Kamiri wrote, Monocore, which I understand that Cheryl actually teaches here at UMass, which is not a direct follow-up. It's not a sequel, but it is a kind of continuation and a sort of further expounding on some of the themes that are in Erdőgödöt. And this is, I should mention, available in a fantastic translation by the translator Rachel Wilson-Broyle. So this you can get in English in the library or on Amazon. And what is different about the second book is it's really about that transgenerational relationship, which is implied in Erdőgödöt, but really explicit in Monocore. It's about an immigrant father and a son who's born in Sweden. It's chronicled really of growing up in Stockholm as a non-white Swede in the 1990s, and it has at its center this kind of fractured relationship between an immigrant to Sweden and his teenage son. And this is an interesting quote, so we'll just take a quick quote from Erdőgödöt. This is the fictional Halim, the teenager writing in his journal saying he swears he's always going to stand against Swedification, Svenifiering. I'm never going to eat herring and drink schnapps at Skansen or dance the Smilgrodere dance in clogs around this lamest maypole. I'm never going to let the politicians ban buffalo shoes or tight shirts or raise the price of hair wax. And what you see in the second book, in Monocore, is this dialogue between actually a kind of mysteriously absent father and a son as kind of an epistolary relationship. And the father writes to his son, or the character of the father writes to his son, and he asks, do you see now, as an adult, that you acted with the logic of the racist? That you and the racist exploited the same terminology, where you hailed everything brown and they everything Swedish. So other works suggest that the market desirability of this sort of this kind of strategic, essentialized, monolithic Blatte identity. It's not restricted to those communities themselves. It's not purely an aspect of kind of teenage identity formation. In Marjane Bakhtiari's Chronicle of Life in Malmö, and Khaled van Ville, which is this volume here, Bakhtiari imagines, or talks about imagined belongings, which inspire a sort of peculiar kind of longing in a white school teacher who wishes that her multicultural students would bring the kind of authentic ethnic foods, the musical instruments, the different languages, the folk tales that they must assuredly enjoy at home into the classroom. She's trying to sort of, like an extractive industry, squeeze these students and get this sort of cultural richness into her classroom. So the school teacher says, please, you nice colored, exotic, warm children, would it kill you to share? Karina screamed at the children in her thoughts. Oh, how she wished it was possible to draw from their warmth and lively cultures, if there was only a way to squeeze it out of them. But what's interesting in Khaled van Ville, which is Bakhtiari's book, is that this notion of the essentialization of this Swedish but also slightly exotic identity is present not only in the school teacher but also in some of her students. So here we have a quote. This is going to sound a lot like Et Egaret. Soroush had it all. The appearance, the flag on the wall, the gold-plated Iran around his neck. He had lived in Iran for exactly 415 days, which is something he compensated for with posters of his singer, the Azadi Tower in Tehran, and religious symbols from the pre-Islamic period. He had laboriously built up a homeland in 20 square meters, a nation where he felt he belonged to more and more each time someone wondered where he came from originally. His loyalty increased every time he answered Iran. Soroush had succeeded in constructing a closeness to something distant and foreign, and created for himself an identity completely of his own. Now, if you zoom further out, so we've talked about life in Stockholm, we've talked about life in Malmö, but I think it's helpful to go out a little bit and consider the situation in Denmark, because we find actually that this desire for this constructed non-white identity, both the fear of that possibility as well as the desire for it, is no means restricted to Sweden. There's a fascinating book, I think I have it here somewhere, called Nya Stemma, which came out in 2007, I think. Has anybody heard of Nya Stemma? So this was the result of a competition started by Jakob Høyer, who was a journalist. And he looked at Sweden from his position in Denmark, and he says the following. He says, in general reflection of Danish literature, there is a total shortage of novels from immigrant authors, according to a review in today's paper. Because of this, Danes and Danish literature are missing out on the voices which, in neighboring lands, such as Germany, Sweden, and England, are there to create greater cultural breadth and diversity in literature. Here, authors such as Salman Rushdie, Hanif Qureshi, Monica Ali in England, or the bestseller Jonas Hassan Khemiri in Sweden, which all ethnic groups in the two countries profit from reading. The ethnic minorities can suddenly see themselves in literature in the Swedish or English, and the ethnic British or Swedes can get acquainted with the new cultures in the world of the novels. So Høyer puts out this challenge. He says, we don't have this in Denmark, and we need it. We're not going to let ourselves be eclipsed by the Swedes. And he starts a competition called New Voices, Nya Stemma, which gathered together a group of authors to produce exactly this type of literature, this ethnic literature, that Denmark had previously lacked. So this is something people can come up and take a look at after the talk. Now, the notion of this ethnic voice, whether it be in the mannered and syntax and slang of Halim's journal, or the depictions of the concrete housing projects in Aniuru's poetry, where the Arabs learn to play soccer in Spanish, they find, I think, an ultimate expression in a short story written by Alejandro Levenwenger. This is the one book I don't have with me. He published a collection in 2001 called Tilvorara. And this, one of the stories in that collection of short stories is called Elixir. And it's important to talk a little bit about what Elixir is about. If you try to read Elixir, you will have to read it many times to figure out exactly what's going on. But in general, it's following a group of young Latino teenagers in Stockholm. And what happens to them one day is that a package comes in the mail. And the package doesn't have any kind of return address. So they open it up. And inside they find a bottle. And it's a glass bottle, and it's got some sort of really murky liquid in it. And so, being teenagers, they drink it. And first, nothing happens. and they're incredibly disappointed because they're hoping for some kind of high. But slowly, some changes emerge. Now, on the top is the Swedish, and on the bottom is my own translation that attempts to preserve some of the orthography. So what happens after one of them drinks it? When we talk, he talks different. I said, what the hell are you talking about like that, Fatso? And he said, you talk just like a Swede, because he did. You couldn't hear that he was brown, and he said words that Swedes know. So the boy's realization of the transformative power of the elixir stirs their imagination. Over the course of the short story, they start to realize that they're turning white. And it actually draws a lot of attention to how they perform their Latino identity. Suddenly, the ones who had drunk the elixir start performing better on literature tests in high school. They show that mastery of Strindberg that was so important to Kalafatidis, right? And eventually, their hair starts to lighten, and their brown eyes becomes bluer. So in a sense, the story becomes a kind of Kafkaesque metamorphosis of these Latino teenagers into fully assimilated Swedish citizens. Yet the problem is that the changeability of their identity, from marked as Latino to marked as Swedish, begins to frighten them, because the elixir's power to transform their bodies is matched by its ability to transubstantiate the soul. The boys decide that they have to stop drinking this before it's too late, but that comes not quick enough for a shocking denouement. I think it was already too late, because when we were going home from Vorburg to Fittja, I didn't dare jump the turnstile. I stood there and said to myself, come on, but I didn't dare go through the gate. So I walked home the whole way and thought, is it because I've begun to be in my heart? So having provided the boys with blonde hair and blue eyes, the elixir completes its work by exerting its pull on the behavior of the teenagers in the public sphere of the municipal subway, this public sector infrastructure which sort of represents the Swedish state. In this site of transportation, which is so linked with the development of the million program suburbs, the concrete housing estates which ring large cities, which have become, in general, characterized as being a space of ethnic difference. The narrator comes face to face with a frightening change in his interaction with state infrastructure. He's no longer able to jump the turnstile to Plunkett, and just to avoid paying the fare. He's begun to act like a Swede because this is one of the behavioral characteristics which fairly or unfairly is associated with immigrant teenagers, jump the turnstile. Something that a true Swede would never do because he or she believes in solidarity and contributing to the welfare state, right? Now, there are a lot of ways to read Elixir as a parody or satire. There have even been people who've read it as a kind of Latin American magical realism tradition, which I think is probably borderline racist. But I think what is interesting, just because the guy's from Chile, what is interesting is that what Alejandro Leavenger is interested in doing is interjecting irrationality into the debate over integration. What he's really doing by this kind of fantasy story, this metamorphosis story, right, somebody turning into a cockroach, is he's corporealizing the ideological assumptions of the integration ministry. Wenger, in this work, Elixir, imagines a world where the implicit goals of assimilation become manifest in the real world, creating, at least for his protagonists, a ghost story from which they cannot escape. So I want to conclude today by considering the last of the three strategies we talked about at the beginning. We talked about how the national literature and even national language begins to be pushed at by some of these authors. We've talked about how kind of the irrational and the fantasy intercede into a kind of utilitarian logical debate about behavior and appearance. But finally, I want to think about linguistic and personal style. There are a lot of examples of style being important to the main characters in the books we've looked at today. In Marjane Bakhtiari's book about Malmö, the female protagonist decides about halfway through the book that she's going to start wearing a headscarf. And this is completely anathema to her parents, who are completely scandalized and have no understanding of why their secular daughter would begin to wear a headscarf. But this marks her in a certain way, and it's a part of her identity she's interested in exploring to the same degree that Halim is interested in exploring a kind of alternate kind of Swedish for his journal. Halim himself, in addition to writing in kind of a fantasized immigrant Creole, can usually found going around Stockholm carrying two things. He's always carrying his journal, which he's writing in, and he's also wearing a kind of bargain basement fez of dubious authenticity, which he buys at the flea market out in the suburbs. So all of these have to do with sort of demonstrating belonging through taking on these kind of loaded aspects of personal or sartorial style. And of course, Wenger is the one who pushes this to the limit by saying it's not just about the clothes you're wearing, but what happens when your skin turns white and your eyes turn blue, and you find yourself on the other side of that turnstile completely unable to jump over it. So as we've seen, these aspects of personal style are mirrored by the inventive and even idiosyncratic approach to language that most of these authors take. We've seen Halim's kind of invented Halimska, this kind of Halimish language. But Bakhtiari's book about Malmö is also really interesting to look at. It's sometimes hilarious and sometimes kind of merciless in its depiction of Swedishes, I would say. In addition to representing the exact phonemes that immigrants from various parts of the Middle East cannot master when they speak Swedish. So she has a whole bunch of people talking in a cafe from different countries, and she transcribes phonetically how each of their basically phonemic vocabulary fails to match the kind of expected Swedish standard. But she also captures in her novel the heavy Southern Scanian accent of the main character's boyfriend's vaguely racist grandfather. So this is like, hur var det jag kommer till utvecklingsland som Sverige, right? So she writes all of this phonetically, as well as the sort of Svengelska of her boyfriend's father, right, which is on the slide here. The other example you'd point to is in terms of Monocore, Kimuri's second book, which is characterized in the father's discourse, the immigrant's discourse, of this really incredible language, which is sort of a francophone North African admixture of completely improbable French loanwords, which surely have not occurred in Swedish since the court of Gustav III, as well as like Arabic portmanteaus that come in every so often. So for all these authors, these questions of clothing, appearance, of language, they really aren't superficial. They're not distractions from Swedish literature of the 2000s. They're really key vectors of how this era of Swedish literature confronts new and more flexible constructions of national belonging. And I think one theoretical framework that resonates for me in thinking about that is Michael Warner's work, Publics and Counterpublics, because Warner says, he claims that in modernity, an extraordinary burden of world-making comes to be borne above all by style. And the authors of the books that we've looked at today, I think they can be thought of as attempting to answer the question that Warner sets out in this volume, which is how and by what rhetoric one might bring a public into being when extant modes of address and extant modes of intelligibility seem themselves to be a problem. So just in conclusion here, I think we've seen how contemporary Swedish literature is existing in this context of transition and uncertainty. And that does afford certain openings for a new imagination of post-ethnic national identity. And this imagination is concerned with the public sphere, with the rights and the responsibilities of participation in it. There's a notion of being able to express yourself by pushing the boundaries of language and literature to make them responsive to the needs of the individual, rather than accept the limitations that are given out by sort of 19th century programmatic nationalism and linguistic standardization. In the vacuum left by the decline of the rationalist modernist welfare state project, there does seem to be increased room for imagination and fantasy, such as the transformation of Latino bodies into perfectly conformant white, blue-eyed bodies who wouldn't ever jump the turnstile on the subway. And then finally, style as being kind of a marker of national belonging or imagined community or a kind of a post-ethnic counterpublic. And as well as all of this being sort of a battleground for how these questions will be debated in the future. I think I'll close here, but I might just talk very quickly at the very end about some of the new directions for research in this area. So one of the things that is kind of interesting to me, I wrote a lot on this work from 2001 to 2007. And one of the things that was always at the margins of these literary works was a paraliterary archive, a magazine called Gringo. Has anybody read Gringo or heard of Gringo? Gringo was given away free in the free Metro newspaper that you got on the subway. And so Metro was just like a newspaper. You got a little, ad-supported thing. But in the middle of it, in a couple of years in the 2000s, you might find this insert. And the insert was called Gringo. And the name is ironic. And Gringo was really about this imagined Blatta identity. It was a kind of strategic essentialist project to build an audience, a marketable audience around the notion of being Swedish but not being white. And it was really all about sort of new ways of being Swedish, of ways of being Swedish even if you had an Arabic last name, or even if you had dark skin and black hair, even if you lived in a suburb that people were afraid to travel to. So there's some interesting intersections between Gringo and debates in more broadly. There was a difficult moment between Ebba Witt-Brattström and Gringo where there was a lot of, the editorial pages of Gringo became a venue for attacks against this person who's very important in Swedish cultural politics. But because it's not a novel, because it's really more of a newspaper with date stamps and sort of defined articles, what we're sort of interested in doing is thinking about Gringo as less a site for close reading, less a site for traditional analysis of discourse, and really kind of an opportunity to do some digital humanities work. And what I mean by that is to think about it as a site for text mining. There's a lot of different things you can do to texts if you have a large collection of them. But one of the things you can do is you can try to algorithmically discover place names. And what this really lets you do is it lets you spatialize discourse. It lets you figure out how are people talking about space in the nation or space in the city. And as I think is implicit in a lot of the work we've looked at, from beginning with the poetry of the suburban concrete suburbs of Gothenburg, to the importance of the subway in Elixir, to Halim walking around Stockholm writing in his journal, I think urban space is really important in this discussion. So what we're interested in doing is taking the entire archive of Gringo and thinking about it from a kind of spatial perspective. So what I'll do here is show you what this looks like. We have a kind of view here of the archive. And so these are all the covers of Gringo at the bottom, but that's not the important part. You can read each of these articles if you want to. What we really want to do is we want to spatialize them. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a map of Stockholm. And we're going to see that there's kind of a heat map here. Here's the heat map of the entire Scandinavian area. Let's zoom into Stockholm. So in Stockholm, we've got little blips on the map as if it were a weather map. And instead of storms, what we've got is mentions of particular neighborhoods or suburbs. So if I move my mouse over Rinkeby, for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get all the contextualizations of the word Rinkeby in these articles. So I'm just looking at this quickly. I got en fest i Rinkeby och Skärholmen. I've got things like Latino i Rinkeby. Jag har besökt Rinkeby flera gånger. And then you'll click through and see the particular articles. You can also probably find Alcala Justa. Those of you who believe that the West Coast is the best coast, we can go into here and see this is all true of Biskopsgården or Bergsjön. I mean, none of this is going to be surprising to you. So this is kind of a project in development, and I think what we're interested in doing is, it's really not worth doing this on a particular novel, but it is interested in doing this in kind of context where we want to be able to take an enormous amount of material and look at it in a kind of spatialized way. Great, so with that, I'll thank you for your time and entertain any questions.
Thank you so much for this brilliant and thought-provoking presentation, especially this project with Gringo and specialization. It's super interesting. We have to talk about that more. So yeah, I have two questions. So we'll start with one of them and see what happens. So in your talk, you pointed to an important paradox, namely the fact that these literary works tended to be received, especially in the case of Camille's first book, as representing a multicultural Sweden, and more specifically, language invented by the protagonist Helen as a natural expression of a general immigrant vernacular in Sweden. So at the same time, as your talk so clearly demonstrated, their main characteristics of these works is rather to be described as a play with and explorations of notions of fluid identities and their instability. So there was clearly a desire for this kind of ethnic turn for these new voices, but the writers themselves did not want such a representative function ascribed to them, which also led to a discussion on so-called immigrant authors, writers being interpreted differently than other normal writers, Swedish authors, normal in quotation marks. So rather in terms of representation than aesthetic complexity. So in a way, they gained access to the literary field in terms of being tokenized, at least initially, as representatives of an imagined exotic other. So the way to a post-ethnic imaginary, an exploration of belonging beyond the configuration of white ethnicity, Nordic language, and Nordic citizenship, seems at least first to have been simultaneously a kind of ethnic turn on the part of literary criticism. Would you agree with such a description?
Yeah, I think that all of us who work on this can quote really interesting excerpts from reviews of Et Degaret when it first came out. One of the best quotes ever is somebody says this is like somebody took a microphone and put it down on the main plaza of Skärholmen or something like that. And what's implicit in this is that it's this documentary, evidentiary value, which is cool. It shows a certain type of valuation that the reviewer is putting on the book. But of course, obviously, it is denying the work's artistic value, that it ceases to become a literary work and instead becomes a kind of documentary, sociological text, which it most assuredly is not. One of the theories could be that if you read Et Degaret and then you read Monocore and you ask how has language changed between these two, the kind of incredibly idiosyncratic, unique language that the father character writes in this book is completely uninterpretable as sociological. It's just so inventive. It really is more like, maybe like everything is illuminated. The boy in the Ukraine who learns English, and it's like this crazy English all throughout the book. So I think perhaps, I don't want to ascribe anything to Kamiri that I don't know for sure, but I think that in this book he succeeded in producing a kind of amazing language that nobody dared take as true to life, because it was just so inventive and so crazy. And so he may have learned his lesson with this one. I remember when the first time I read, I didn't read Elixir first, I heard it. And that's because Alejandro Leva did a recording of this Elixir short story on a CD that was put out as like a promotional thing. And so in that recording, Alejandro chooses to read the story with what I would say as a kind of Latino-inflected Swedish. I mean, it's difficult to know how you would read the text of this without kind of doing that performance. But on the other hand, there are other stories in Tillgård that have nothing to do with ethnicity, and they're truly just sort of literary in nature. So I think every author has this strategy to escape what you've pointed out, which is absolutely true, which is this nut bar interpretation of high literature as somehow having evidentiary value or only evidentiary value. You could ask yourself, Sara Lidman wrote a whole bunch of books about the very high north of Sweden in the Järnbanan series. Very few people interview Sara Lidman and say, what are we going to do about this part of the country? It's poorer. We're not even sure if they're really Swedish, to be honest. Nobody says that to Sara Lidman because her work is essentially received as literary. But works about other parts of marginalized Sweden are somehow, and all of us have been at book talks where one of these authors, after a great reading, gets a question of thank you very much, really loved your book, so what should we do? What is the solution to multiculturalism? And we've all seen those authors get a little frustrated because it's that's not what I'm here for, right? That's not to preclude their involvement in cultural debates. So all of us all think of times where some of these authors have gotten involved, from Wenger to Kamiri, in cultural debates. But I think usually they try not to say, as you can see on page 3 of my novel, we should not have a language test, right? They try to stay away from the novel evidence for that. So yeah, I think that's a real risk that people have, and I think it really does have to do also, it's the flip side of this, the desire for something new. So all of these authors, in addition to all of the injustices I've just mentioned, have also been profiled in Dagens Nyheter and other places with amazing photography, and there is something exciting about this moment, and it is difficult to know how much of that is bound to a Swedish poet who looks like this, right? The author's pictures are oftentimes in the book. It would be interesting if to do like an analysis of how often do authors get photographed in mainstream Swedish fiction, and how often did this generation get photographed. It may be completely even. But I think that's one of the things that is probably a necessary. It's kind of it's something that did happen, absolutely, and all of these authors reacted against it and wrote. There's a great piece on in the journal Pequod by Astrid Trotzig about this problem. It came out a couple years ago about being interpreted sociologically rather than from a sort of literary perspective. But I do think it's interesting to read the next novels of each of these authors and see how they discovered this problem and sort of tried to write their way around it.
Yeah. So I have more questions stored, but I think we should open the discussion. And I think I saw your hand first, Nicole.
Just a reaction to the question and also the discussion. Did you find that the authors, or when you talked about the tokenism and the view of them as quote-unquote exotic, and how to unpack and manage that in terms of, did the original, because when you were telling the story in your presentation, I immediately thought of Kafka.
Yeah,
the
right.
metamorphosis. And did others draw that connection and see sort of the literary strains of where the story was going, or did they, as a default position, go into, as you said, the more social science interpretations of the experience they were describing?
Right. Well, it's interesting with Tilvara because it is this collection of like 5 to 7 short stories, and so each reviewer, I think, fixated on a different part of it. And it's a really rich and robust collection of stories, and so you'd have to first of all fasten it down to like which ones talked about either elixir or the other one, which explicitly treats ethnicity. It's actually an interracial relationship in that other short story. My guess is that because Tilvara was so early, people also, my memory of the reviews is that people also fixated on the Spanish slang in there, just like they fixated on the Turkish and Arabic slang in Etikeret. Interestingly enough, Wenger was kind of took a break after his first book in our honor, and he then has reemerged, and he had emerged also in kind of a political way before this most recent work. But he was one who sort of went underground and didn't feel like, his interview with him where he said, after the book came out, first book, I could have easily written a book about Scanian farmers, but I didn't, and so now everybody thinking it's this big thing about Latino identity, but that just happens to be what I chose. I don't know if that's really true. I don't know if, it's possible that he could have done a book about Scanian farmers, but I think that it would take somebody with, I think Alejandro has a unique set of skills, and part of that was capturing a kind of an adolescence of Latino teenagers in a way that I wonder if the reverse would be true. In fact, we would have questions if a white author in America wrote the great novel of African-American adolescence. We might wonder, like, what is going on here, right? So there is a sensitivity associated with that. Yeah.
Okay, so Grete.
First?
Yes, please go ahead.
First and foremost, thanks so much for a wonderful talk. Very, very interesting. You basically were speaking about Sweden. I mean, that's your field, but you mentioned along the way also Denmark, and you were saying that there were no similar expressions by modern second generation names. But I mean, you have these famous Scandinavian best-selling poet, Yahya Hassan. But interestingly enough, what he does is to tear apart the culture that he was raised in as a Muslim immigrant in Denmark. And it received extremely bad reviews in Sweden. Yeah. Whereas both in Denmark and in Norway, this was hailed as something revolutionary, it was absolutely new, and it was mind-blowing. And it was good poetry at the same time. So this is, I mean, have you reflected on this? You know of Yahya Hassan and his work? I mean, he is definitely a Denmark.
Right. Well, I think one of the things to think about is so if we look at Jakob Hoya's Call, which comes out in, this is like 2000, part of the longer article from which we're citing here, yes, this is 2006, is a whole set of conditions on what is acceptable for ethnic literature. What is going to be as good as don't ask me why Salman Rushdie and Jonas Hassan Khemiri are in the same bucket here. No offense to either one, but I don't see their authorships. Yes, but let's just pretend it's all about Khemiri. Hoya actually sets out a whole set of criteria for who is acceptable as a Danish ethnic, as kind of like post-ethnic, second-generation author. And if you go further into this piece, and it actually might be in the introduction to this too, he explicitly calls out and says, what we don't want is any more stories by Korean adopted children. So what does he mean by that? Well, there's this great, on the poetry angle, there's this great work by Maja-Lee Langbell called Fint Holgedanske. And it's this great sort of autobiographical art poetry work in which she sort of remixes her adoption paperwork. So Maja-Lee was adopted into Denmark from South Korea. And she takes all of the original paperwork that was associated with that transfer and rewrites it and sort of types over it and sort of photoshops it to make it say different things. And then she has a whole bunch of poetry about that links to obviously the legend of Holger Dansk, and then also the Janteloven and all this different stuff. And so she rewrites a whole bunch of sort of canonical Dano-Norwegian texts. I think that's what Jakob Hoya didn't want, because, and this is sort of going into the weeds, I think there's a notion of Korean adopted children are too integrated, that is often perceived as not really the problem that people need to solve. The problem is the immigration from either Africa or the Middle East or Latin America. So it is interesting who gets counted in this, and why did Hoya think that there was this lack of it. You can also think of Rashid Rashid's Du lovede vi skulle hjem and other works that are kind of more on the autobiographical side. The Danish stuff I kind of treat as I was mostly interested in it because it looked to Sweden and said, look at this stuff that's going on, and we don't have anything, and we got to artificially create this competition to get it. But you're right that every nation has even within the Nordic countries, there are these kind of blindnesses, these lacunae that people just don't see.
Right, so keep waving. I'm going to put you on the list. Now I have Ben.
I kind of jumped the line. So two questions. Well, first, Peter, it's a pleasure to hear you speak because I've read your work and it's really very, very, very engaging. The first is short and simple. There are those, I'm thinking of to be us, even us in particular in Sweden, who would like to see, thank you, Marcus, who would like to see the word immigrants more or less pushed out of public discourse because he sees it as a sort of euphemism and a placeholder for white versus non-white. And there are scholars as well, some pieces that are going to be coming out in the Scandinavian Studies Journal fairly soon, looking at that question within the world of literature and kind of pointing out how people who get the label immigrants, it's not only that they might be dealing with what is to be recognized as a social problem, what Hoya seems to be commenting on. It's also those who could be perceived as white versus not white. Jan Guillou is not an immigrant, right? So I was interested to hear if you had any thoughts about when and in what circumstances race should be injected into this. Second question that I have, I'll just skip to it and let you answer whichever one you want. The term post-ethnic did catch my attention as it seemed to also caught Marcus's. And I wonder to what extent can we really talk about a sort of post-ethnicity here, because ethnic boundaries, even if they are ceremonially crossed in some sense, seem to be intractably present here. And so much of this border crossing is unintelligible. So that's a piece of expression if ethnicity isn't there to work with. And I wondered whether it wouldn't be more appropriate to talk about a rising separation between nation, ethnicity, citizenship, rather than some breakdown and reformulation of Swedishness per se.
Well, those are both great questions. So in the first one, there's this, Kalafatidis who has the quote, like, how long do I have to wander, which is a play on the invandrere, somebody who wanders in, right? I think the use of the word immigrant on people who are born in Sweden is a weird thing, right? We can talk about, but it often is used as pars pro toto for a bigger thing. Second generation immigrant is really what we should talk about, but I'm not sure how I feel about that term either. You're right that the overwhelming, as we heard yesterday, the overwhelming foreign presence in Sweden is and has always been Finns. And the exact illegibility of that difference is the problem. At certain points explicitly, like the 1930s, but then also Stina Langerna, the sort of thinking about class and ethnicity in sort of the the Finnish Swedish work that has come out recently. When you were asking this question, I looked at the bio here, and so this biography was also present in the hardcover first edition. The first line of this biography is, Jonas Hassan Khemiri is born in Stockholm in 1978 of a Swedish mother and a Tunisian father. I don't know what the Monaco biography says. They may have dropped that. But that's the problem, right? Where yes, they've taken out the sort of racial mixture percentage as quantification. That's a challenge, right? That a lot of the attacks on Etta when the inevitable backlash was that his author is kind of upper middle class, studied at the business school, extraordinarily competent in language, competent enough, as I said, to play with it. And this kind of gets to the sociological evidence aspect of this has very little to do, and I think this would be his point too, this has very little to do with the question of mother tongue instruction, right, for people who are fresh off the boat, right? You just have to keep these domains separate because it's a whole different thing. The second question about the post-ethnic and about how useful is that? I think what's, as always, this very diverse and non-monolithic literature never provides answers, but what it does is suggest oftentimes these authors will sort of poke at something from such an extreme position that it casts the other side of something into relief. And I think clearly when Wenger talks about, what if there were a magical elixir that you could drink, and it would change your skin and your hair color and your behavior? Is that what we want? Like, let's just take the logic of the integration ministry to its ultimate exponent. Why not go there? And you say it's absurd, but then, okay, well, where is that line? Where do you say that, pronouncing Swedish according to Riksvenska rules like RP in Great Britain, is that what we want to aim at? Or we are okay with people having sort of sociolects, right? That isn't going to be discriminated against in school, it's not going to be discriminated against in the workplace. Will it be discriminated against in national TV? Can we have people who speak perfect Swedish, but with some phonemes and leveling that is associated with immigrant communities? I think this is a regional question, it's a national question. It probably has a really interesting valence in Norway where a celebration of local dialect is I think, a national characteristic. That may not be true in some of the other countries. So I don't know, I was struggling for a word about, you can see all my different drafts of like, well, maybe post/national, post-ethnic, ethnic turn. What's clear is all this stuff is in play, and I think that, as always, this literature is not going to provide us answers, but it's going to sort of cast light in unexpected directions that are going to make ourselves ask these questions about what does it mean when you have somebody, in Khemiri's terms, to have an accent on purpose? Like, what does that do? And is that acceptable? Does that, how does that get treated by an audience? What's interesting is that it's difficult to ascribe the actual motivations of people who buy things, but all of these books sold really well. I mean, they were really celebrated, and I think that's really exciting in a way, because these books don't offer clean solutions. They don't even really necessarily offer happy endings. So I think that it's a positive characteristic of Swedish society that this fiction, as participating in this discursive field where it's hard to even know what to call it, has been sort of read by so many people, and I think that that's a positive sign for some of the more intractable sociological and political science questions, that people have an interest in this, and they have an interest in it not purely in the kind of binary choice of do we increase immigration from this country, or what do we do about skilled labor, and more in this kind of this non-rationalist, this kind of experiential space where if 100,000 Swedes buy this book, you'll have 100,000 different experiences and different reactions.
The next question for Caroline.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. That was very inspiring. I have a question actually in terms of how you use. So I think you read, if I understood correctly, Camus' protagonist Halim in terms of this sort of Spivak's, strategic essentialism, and you talk about how this is used in creation of some sort of a shared identity between those minorities. I wonder how do you reconcile this concept when it's juxtaposed with some of the maybe more recent scholarship that actually talks about removing, so going away from this sort of homogeneous representation of racialized others,
Right.
Because that poses some sort of a threat to those groups being othered, some sort of internal othering.
Yeah.
I don't know how you see that.
Oh yeah, no, nobody is a bigger proponent of that than Gayatri Spivak. Like, she has a whole article where she's like, oh my God, stop this train. I've forgotten the exact quote, but it's something like, what people focused on the essential and not the strategic, and that's a horrendous mistake, and oh my God. What is interesting about that is that I mentioned very quickly at the end the Gringo stuff, which is I find really fascinating, and I haven't looked at as closely as I want to yet. But here's the deal with Gringo. Gringo is absolutely on board with this notion of strategic essentialism, partly because the people who ran it are very effective marketers. If you read Gringo, it's like got these ads in it from like the huge employment agencies in Sweden, people who deal with like sort of contingent temporary jobs, or 7-Eleven, big chains where it's like, do you want to work? We respect diversity. Come to us. It's this. They've identified a market segment, and for the selling ads against their content, as sort of controversial and spicy as their content was, attacking Eva Bafstrom, fundamentally they're about selling ads. And they realized there was this kind of post-ethnic turn moment where you could get like McDonald's Sweden to say, come work for us because we don't care what you look like, we care that you're just a professional and we're going to give you management opportunities and stuff like that. So here's the point. Halim would have been an amazing staff writer for Gringo if he existed. Like they're totally on board here. And I think the difference is that Halim is fictional, and that Bakhtiari and Kamiri and Wenger generally just took complete distance from Gringo because they didn't want exactly what you said, that kind of false, monolithic, all brown people are the same, right? This is what the father figure in Monocor says. Do you see that you were basically doing business with the logic of racists, that you celebrate everything that is blatte, and that's just, Ben may talk about this too, in the sense that there is a kind of racial segregationist, racial supremacist exists in many different contexts, and in Latin America with a kind of celebration of the mestizo. Like racisms exist everywhere, and they may originate in certain spaces and be transferred in certain ways, but the notion of essentialism, strategic or not, is attractive, and it's like a poison apple. Everybody wants to take a bite. So what I think is cool about the Swedish literary space, or the paraliterary space, is you've got Gringo, which is absolutely trying to create this imagined homogenous identity, which effaces and wipes out the differences in experience between, for example, non-Arab Muslims, like people from Iran or people from North Africa, right? You just wipe it out, and it's all about like, let's just create this identity. So you can see that it's very inclusive in that sense. You've got Chinese Swedes here, right, on the cover. You've got all sorts of stuff. The downside is that it's all under this notion of like a shared experience, which is primarily defined by, I would say, Swedish racism, right? It's like, and I think what's fascinating about, if you ever speak to Rachel Wilson-Broyles, I don't know if she's ever tried to translate it. I don't believe it's ever been translated. The problem there is that, or with any work, what do you do with the word blatte? Because American English does not have one single word for a non-white person. American English, of course, has like an infinite variety of offensive terms for people from almost every place in the world. And some of them are archaic, and some of them are not used anymore, and some of them have been appropriated and turned into, and some of them change, and you have these archaic uses of words like colored in organizational terms that, the NAACP, but that you would never say as an adjective today. But what we don't have is we don't have a word like blatte. And so what do you translate it as? You translate it as brown or something. It's just really hard to figure out what's going on. British English does, I think. I won't say it out loud, but I think in British English there is a way to talk about people who are not white. But that's the logic of the racism, right? That it was possible to produce Gringo only because there was a kind of universalized racism against people who weren't white. Whereas I think in the United States, speaking as an American, you can find this infinitely variegated racism against people from the Middle East or people who are African American or Native American, anything you want. So gringo, I think, could only exist in a Swedish context.
I didn't quite catch. Is Gringo still published as a free paper?
No, it isn't. It's too bad. I have an archive of all of it, physical and virtual. What happened was it was this amazing bubble, right, where they founded Gringo. It started as a free insert, then became its own journal. These are actually the covers of the journal. Started getting all these ads from like huge companies like Volvo. We don't discriminate. Come work in Gothenburg. It's really, really cool. Then they did a spin-off called Macho, which was about gender in Sweden. They attracted some really interesting editors there. But then it gets better. They started a business consultancy called, I think, Zebra. Yeah, think of the symbolism there. Zebra was like helping, if you're Volvo and you're afraid that there's like all these amazing engineers who immigrated from Tunisia who, for cultural reasons, you don't hire because people discriminate based on the last name. So Zebra would come in and help Volvo like hire these amazing engineers. So it was this empire based on kind of like these flaws in Swedish society. Then they didn't pay their taxes. Possibly the most Swedish way of going bankrupt ever, right? It's like skattefusk. So kaboom, gone. But that actually makes it more interesting to study because it's bounded in time, right? It's like this one thing that did a lot of interesting work, just from a completely opposite perspective of these high literary authors who just took complete distance from the essentializing, market-driven identity that was promulgated in Gringo.
Any more comments or questions on that? Eric.
One follow-up thought is saying that there's no term for like non-white people in the U.S. when you hear POC so much in university now. Like certainly not as a derogatory term.
Right.
You hear people using that.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah.
But like it's definitely being taken up in the sense that you're saying like there's kind of strategic essentialism
That's
happening, and to me that's like pretty new. It's like the last 10 years at most.
Yeah, that's right.
So I don't know. I thought that was interesting. It's very much the time frame of when these kind of ethnic literature products are coming out in media, and what does that do, or what does it react to in terms of the political climate? Is an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's right.
Yeah.
It's not sort of
No, it's not equivalent, but it's sort of taking foreign mediums.
Right. So an interesting test for that term would be if you had a historicizing POC conference, could you do a paper on the Irish Americans, right, who were not white at a certain point, who only became white after a certain point. But you're right, that's a great example of something in a positive valence that does cover that.
But even the word choice of the magazine, Gringo, Macho, they're appropriating terms from the sort of Hispanic Latin experience. I mean, Gringo has a very distinct concept.
Right, and it's the opposite, right? This is the one thing this magazine is not for. Although you could argue that it maybe sold, it became a journal which was then sold. It would be fascinating to look at the demographics who bought it, because there is a market for white folks who are like, need to get woke, gotta buy this stuff. I think it's interesting that the flag is inverted, right? Like, so there's an interesting thing there.
It is, it would be fascinating. And then like the macho, and you say answering gender issues, that is a very interesting term to appropriate, especially.
Right, that's right. Thanks.
So yes, perhaps I could, I just wanted to comment on the interesting case of Yahya Hassan, and just to nuance about the Swedish reception of his collection. There were indeed many critics who thought it was an amazing artwork. But there was indeed a discussion it wasn't so much of a discussion rather than a piece written by the Swedish author Athena Farrokhzad, who were often discussed in these contexts of kind of how Swedishness and identity and national belonging, where she was really critical of the fact that Yahya Hassan kind of had become this, at least initially, this darling of the far right, and that he was critical of his own group of Islam and so on. I don't think Hassan ever replied to that more than just basically fuck off, or what do you I do whatever I please. But I think this kind of exchange is also interesting to perhaps study in detail, right? And says something about differences. Right, I also wanted to ask you about the crucial role of style. And as you pointed out, many of these writers in their works, and also in works that have been published since these you have mentioned, that they play with different languages or varieties in their works, and how this also contributes to expanding the notion of Swedish literature. I think this is very true. And in general, there's also a strong tendency of reflections around the connection between identity and language, right? Also of the politics of language. For example, as we have talked about, you mentioned, the need to master Swedish without an accent in order to pass as a real Swede. And often these and other contemporary writers describe tensions between generations, right? You have written about this in articles. For example, immigrant parents who stress the importance of learning Swedish and sometimes also try to suppress or forget, stop talking their mother tongues with their children because this is considered to be an obstacle on the path to national belonging, right? But then you have children or grandchildren who regard this as a betrayal. Why did you rob me of my roots, for example? This is a theme also present in Faruk Saad's The White Blight, a recent poetry collection which has been translated into English. So languages, but also the lack of language that used to be in your family can give rise to feelings of loss, shame, and anger. You have also this kind of dynamic present in Sami literature, or literature by former Finnish labor migrants. Most common example, often quoted, is Susanna Alakoski's, right, The Swine Rose. So would you like to comment on this description? Do you agree?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about absence. And so in Et Agaret, the absence is, in a sense, Halim's completely deficient understanding of the world. And in fact, I think there's a confrontation sometime in the book where the father asks him, what do you know about the prisons in the country that I came from? What do you know about the king whose picture you have on your desk? It's that, and of course, the Halim describing himself as a thought sultan, going along with his ersatz fez on his head, appropriating a kind of sociolect that isn't really his, but he wants to make his, is a part of kind of filling in those gaps, spackling over parts he finds absence. In Monocore, of course, is really a heartbreaking book, and it's the absence of the father and the sort of epistolary conversation between them and figuring out, it's kind of in a sense, it's kind of a mystery novel. You have to really figure what is going on, what happened, like what's going on here. I think that absence or that missingness of the authentic foreign experience stands at the center, I mean, also of the quote of Marjane Bakhtiari of Sarouche, sort of invented an Iran of the mind. It's kind of an imagined Iran. That may be an artifact of a kind of society that historically has seen folks who don't match a certain appearance as being something other, and so if you're confronted with that every day, then you have to kind of figure out, well, then if that's the way that everybody sees me, where is that other that I don't seem to see within myself? One of the kind of interesting, so I feel like the question you asked is really good, and the only ways I know how to answer it are just like find these teeny little glimpses of it, like peeking through texts in some ways. One thing I thought was very evocative of when Kamiri did the summer talk on Swedish radio a couple years ago, or many years ago, I think 10 years ago at this point, where he sort of talks. He would basically give this long, like 40-minute radio narration interspersed with songs that were important to him from growing up. And really, in that discussion, it was all about what was it like. Basically, it was laying the foundation of Monocore. What was it like to ride a bus in Stockholm as a non-white person, visibly non-white person in the 1990s? What music did we listen to? What did we think was going to happen? The other thing you'd say is that that notion of the immigrant experience of coming to a new place, there have been some interesting artists or authors who flip that around. The obvious one is Farnar Zababi, who took Wilhelm Moberg's The Emigrants staged it in Sweden as a traveling show with it. Of course, the immigrants is famous about Swedes coming to America, eventually end up in Minnesota. And our Bobby stages it as people from outside Sweden coming to Sweden, people from, it's sort of a mixture of people from the global south. And that, in that original series of novels, of course, there is like this confrontation with English, right? Because Swedes are here like, what? I can't understand this. Like, I have no understanding. And she flips that around, right? Because she sort of gets that, basically just everything's inverted of the immigrants coming to Sweden. So I feel like in some of these works, you get glimpses of some of the social conditions or the kind of cultural valences that might produce texts in which a kind of missing background that everybody ascribes to you. This is also present in Karina, the teacher in L'école des enfants de ville, who is just absolutely sure that these students in her class who are black or brown or yellow must have these folk songs at home that they need to bring in. They're keeping them from her, and she just gets incredibly upset. And of course, the kids who must be like 8 years old are like, what are you talking about? Like, they don't see that, right? In a sense, the interesting part, one of the most, I think, affecting parts of this book is that when do the school children begin to see race? And they begin to see race when their white teacher tells them that they are something special, which has a lot of, is probably motivated by positive things, right? But has this devastating effect in some ways of introducing otherness. So I think the question that you ask is really interesting, and I don't know, it could also be just a gap in my reading list of like what books are what texts are the best at getting at that. But I think in the works that I've looked at most closely, that is clearly one of the things that is lurking under the surface. How much do I want to inherit from a place I've never seen, a place I don't understand, and how much do I just want to... I mean, if you look at some of the pictures, say something positive about Gringo, Gringo was very open to people just inventing identities, like high hair from El Salvador, or Chinese Swedish basketball players. Like it's just sort of like people wanted to be what they wanted to be, and whether you accept that or not as being under the frame of this kind of strategic essentialist identity, that's sort of the whole contradiction of Gringo.
Anybody else want to comment or another question? Perhaps we're ready for coffee.
That sounds
I
good.
hope the coffee's ready for us.
Right.
Yes, let's go out and
But thank you very much for the
Thank you.
fantastic